from New York to this area.
Can you hear me? Well, or sort of, little louder? Okay. In the back has confirmed that it's just fine. So thank you for being here this evening. My name is Diane Kresh. I'm the director of Arlington Public Library. We've been doing programs like these for about 16 years. Everyone is different. They're always a thrill, and it's delightful to have so many of you out here this evening. I heard it's cold, so I guess that's the time of year that we're in. Let's take a minute, please, or a second rather, to mute our devices. I've done it for mine. Otherwise, you're going to hear the theme song from Law and Order. On cue. All right, so since 2006, Arlington Reads has brought authors and readers together to discuss the most challenging issues of our times and share the stories of those who are unseen. Lives affected by housing, insecurity, racism, poverty, domestic violence, drug addiction, hunger, immigration, among many others. We're fortunate to have the Friends of Arlington Library as our sponsor in these events. Not only do they pay for all library programming, everything from summer reading through author events like these, they support our mission to be always free and always open. I don't know if any of you went to the book sale a couple of weeks ago. Every hand should be in the air, right? Okay. The money that we earn at the bookstore, at the book sales, all comes back to the library. So it's an enormous benefit. It's not only a fun community event, but it's just terrific support for the library, and we could not do that without the Friends. We're also joined tonight by a representative from PROJECTPeace. They have a table in the lobby if you have questions. They're part of the Department of Human Services, so they're here supporting us as well. And the book signing will be managed by independent bookseller One More Page, which is a terrific bookstore, and they've been a really wonderful friend to us for the last several years. This year's series, Rebooting the Classics, was presented in partnership with Freedom Reads, a first-of-its-kind organization that supports the efforts of people in prison to imagine new possibilities for their lives. It's the brainchild of Reginald Dwayne Betts, poet, lawyer, and prison reform advocate, who also spent 8 years in prison and knows the power of books to open worlds and change lives. Through curated collections of new books and classics reintroduced by contemporary authors, men and women housed in our prisons and detention centers, including Arlington's detention center, can imagine what lies ahead for them once they leave prison. As Betts said in last month's library-sponsored program at the detention center, you can't be what you can't see. Our guest this evening, Andrea Elliott, is also associated with Freedom Reads and led a lively conversation this afternoon with a group of women at the detention center talking about Invisible Child, their lives, and their desire to tell and write their stories. Joining me this evening is my colleague and friend Anita Friedman, director of Arlington's Department of Human Services. And we'll kind of tag team the interview as we go along. Two-time Pulitzer Prize-winning author and investigative journalist Andrea Elliott has dedicated her career to unflinching, immersive reporting. Invisible Child, Poverty, Survival, and Hope in an American City won a 2022 Pulitzer Prize, was one of Barack Obama's favorite books of 2021, and was named one of the best books of the year by NPR, Amazon, and the New York Times. It tells the riveting story of Dasani Coates, a homeless New York schoolgirl whose indomitable spirit is tested by poverty and systemic racism in an unequal America. In her Pulitzer Prize remarks, Andrea said her greatest hope is that Invisible Child will open people's eyes to how poverty, homelessness, and structural racism play out on the ground, and that to see into the life of this one brave child, from her deepest burdens to her greatest hopes, is to see our nation in all its dimensions. Andrea is also a distinguished chronicler of Muslims living in America post 9/11. An Imam in America about a Muslim leader in Brooklyn won the Pulitzer Prize for feature writing in 2007. In their citation, the judges wrote that Elliott's account, beautifully written, provides an unparalleled look into the making of terrorists and is a reporting tour de force. Andrea has served as an Emerson Collective Fellow at New America, a visiting journalist at the Russell Sage Foundation, and a visiting scholar at the Columbia Population Research Center. She is the recipient of a George Polk Award and a Whiting Foundation grant, Columbia University's Medal for Excellence, and was recently the winner of the New York Public Library's 2022 Helen Bernstein Award for Excellence in Journalism. She's appeared on media such as the PBS NewsHour, NPR's Fresh Air and Talk of the Nation, CNN, and BBC. Please welcome Andrea Elliott. Thank you. Wow.
That was a wonderful introduction, and about halfway through, I was like, I want to meet that person. I just still, honestly, when I look out at the audience here, I couldn't be happier to be here. Number one, I'm a DC native, and it's good to be home. Born in Virginia, actually, then went to DC. So, you know, there were so many years that I spent on this book when I couldn't imagine this moment. So I'm just very grateful to be here. This is Dasani. Dasani and I met in 2012 when she was 11 years old. It took me nearly a decade to write what I'm about to read you, which comes actually pretty early into the book. It's the last thing I wrote, but it took me living through all of this to see what I'm about to read to you, because maybe it was the hardest thing, because it's the passage that attempts to explain why she matters and why her life matters. And I want to preface that by saying I know this is long. I've been told it reads quickly, but it is the length of a presidential biography. And I believe that her life is worth every bit as much. And as kind of in honor of that, I very intentionally modeled this passage after something that Robert Caro wrote in the first of his books about LBJ, which was about understanding Lyndon Baines Johnson and the character, in particular, of the 36th President of the United States of America is essential to understanding the character of America. So as a nod to that, to know Dasani Joni LaShawn Coates, to follow this child's life from her first breaths in a Brooklyn hospital to the bloom of adulthood, is to reckon with the story of New York City and beyond its borders with America itself. It is a story that begins at the dawn of the 21st century in a global financial capital riven by inequality. It is also a story that reaches back in time to one Black family making its way through history, from slavery to the Jim Crow South, and then the Great Migration's passage north. There's no separating Dasani's childhood from that of her matriarchs, her grandmother Joni and her mother Chanel. Their fleeting triumphs and deepest sorrows are, in Dasani's words, my heart. The ground beneath her feet once belonged to them. Her city is paved over theirs. It was in Brooklyn that Chanel was also named for a fancy-sounding bottle, spotted in a magazine in 1978. Back then, from the ghetto's isolated corners, a perfume ad was the portal to a better place. Today, Dasani lives surrounded by wealth, whether she's peering into the boho chic shops near her shelter or surfing the internet on Auburn's shared computer. She sees out to a world that rarely sees her. To see Dasani is to see all the places in her life, From the corridors of school to the emergency rooms of hospitals to the crowded vestibules of family court and welfare. Some places are more felt than seen. The place of homelessness, of sisterhood, of a mother-child bond that nothing can break. They dwell within Dasani wherever she goes. To follow Dasani as she comes of age is to follow her 7 siblings, whether they are riding the bus, switching trains, climbing steps, or jumping puddles. They always move as one. Only together have they learned to navigate poverty systems, ones with names suggesting help, child protection, public assistance, criminal justice, homeless services. To watch these systems play out in Dasani's life is to glimpse their power, their flaws, and the threat they pose to Dasani's own system of survival. Her siblings are her greatest solace, their separation her greatest fear. This is freighted by other forces beyond her control: hunger, violence, racism, homelessness, parental drug addiction, pollution, segregated schools. Any one of these afflictions could derail a promising child. As Dasani grows up, she must contend with them all. Now, when I began, let's rewind. This is because this is like 8 years before I wrote this. I'm standing, this is maybe a few weeks before this photograph by the great Ruth Fremson was taken outside Dasani's Brooklyn homeless shelter. And I actually met her. There she is with her family, Chanel in the middle, her mother, and then her stepfather, Supreme, who she regarded as her father, and her 7 siblings. At that time, I really thought I was going to be writing about homelessness, this issue, this very, very current and contemporary and pressing, and continues to this day to be a very important issue. All these years later, what I see is that was really just a signpost, an invitation into to look past the label into what it is a signal of, which is so many other things. I'll get to that in a moment. This was a family that at the time I met them was sharing, all 10 members of this family, one room in a shelter. It was a decrepit shelter in Brooklyn. And as the years came that I continued to follow them, I would witness some of the most outrageous forms of systemic oppression and the most remarkable acts of family courage, resilience, love. I would come to see my own city with new eyes. I would come to see the boundaries of race and class that had never been invisible to Dasani, but are invisible to a lot of people. All of this began with a statistic I saw on my computer that 1 in 5 children in America are growing up poor. Now it's about 1 in 7. We're talking about, in raw numbers, roughly 13 million children. It's the highest child poverty rate of any wealthy nation in the world, and most developed nations. And so that was just sort of jaw-dropping for me, in part because the public discourse was and continues to be so often when it comes to poverty about the adults. It's centered on blaming adults for poor choices, for a lack of self-reliance, a lack of personal responsibility. And we talk about the adults without reckoning with their children, and I kept asking myself, but what about their children? Where are they? This is a community that has very little political clout because A, they don't vote, they have very little power, and B, they tend to live in marginalized communities that are under a lot of surveillance by the government, and they understand that they need to protect their families. And so this is what we would call in journalism a very hard target to write about children who are poor. But I kept asking myself, what about the kids? What about the kids? This is the epigraph of my book, "For these are all our children," wrote James Baldwin. "We will all profit from or pay for what they become." And that is kind of how I set off into this project, was with this idea that when you've got 1/5 of our future workforce growing up in adversity and the stakes are so high, and that regardless of where you sit on the political spectrum, you can't deny the fact that those kids exist and that they are not to blame for their predicament. So my entire focus was them. Dasani immediately stood out to me. She's there she is at church. They had this mobile van church that they attended once a week. She was just, there's so many words to describe her. She was a firecracker. She was feisty and little and electric and full of ideas and sparkly and very, very loquacious. She wanted to talk. She loved telling me things, which was gold for me because so many kids I had interviewed up until then struggled to explain what they were going through, and she wanted to narrate her experience to me, so that was very important. She was one of these kids who beat all the boys at pull-ups even though she was so small. She was also on the honor roll when I met her, even though her life in the shelter, which we'll get to in a minute, was another story. But on the outside, she projected aspiration and drive. And I just wanted to tell that story. I felt compelled to follow her in her life. For all of those reasons, she loved being first. She was, not just on the honor roll, she was the firstborn child of Chanel, who, as I mentioned in the reading I just did, was named after a perfume ad that her mother spotted in a magazine in 1978 from a very segregated part of Brooklyn, Brownsville, which back then in the 70s, city is bankrupt. There are fires everywhere. It's very siloed. A magazine ad was the closest you could get to this other world. And so embedded in their very names from the moment I met them, I saw this kind of interesting narrative arc that you fast forward, 23 years later, and Chanel is now pregnant with her first child, and she's looking for a name, and she's also reaching for something aspirational. And wham, on the bodega shelves of her, bodega is this new product by Coca-Cola, the Dasani bottled water, which had just come out. And this is also very close to where her mother was born, but by now, the wealth had arrived. And so Dasani would grow up in a city that was much more, it was gentrified. I mean, if you know Adams Morgan, you know the story of Adams Morgan, you know the story of Brooklyn. The return to the city, this revitalization is another way to refer to it, but this sudden return to the city and rediscovery of the city that then causes a whole community or parts of a community to disappear and then leaves because of subsidized housing, often two extremes that are remaining. The very poor who have an anchor through housing, like Dasani, who's right there with her sister Aviana, and folks who have moved into these townhouses a few blocks away and are buying them for millions of dollars. And they are living in a close encounter. The poor, a poor kid like Dasani, is growing up with access to all the things that she can't have, but she also has an idea of what those things are because she's surrounded by them. So these were some of the themes that we can get into a little bit later. Just a few blocks away was her shelter, the Auburn family residence. And I went there with my investigative hat on more than anything. I was on the investigative unit. I wanted to get access to the shelter because I'd heard horror stories, but of course the public wasn't allowed anywhere near it. And I wanted to stay I wanted to keep my reporting as quiet as possible. I hesitate to use the word undercover because I'm not a cop, although people suspected I was a quote unquote snitch. But I was hanging out at the front of the shelter talking to mothers and trying to find my way into this story and thinking of it, conceiving of it as a story about child poverty, but also about the shelter. And out walked Chanel. And that family became my portal in. I eventually actually snuck in through the back. We can tell that story later, but set off security, I set off a fire alarm and ran past 4 sets of security guards. My presence went undetected somehow. Inside, there's this room, and all of the family's possessions are in this room. And, there's so much to say. I will just drop a few things into my comments now because otherwise we'll be here all night. But one thing I quickly saw about Dasani's family and their existence in this place was how clear it is that people have very, very big misconceptions about the poor. To survive in poverty requires a lot of innovation. It requires, there's this idea that, for example, the poor don't work. If you are in the shelter, you see that people are working all the time just to survive. It may not look like work in terms of the formal labor market. It might look more like bartering. But so there were just so many things. They would prop a hairdryer on a milk crate and aim it at the baby's crib. This is baby Lily right there, to keep her warm at night because there was no heat. Just so little control over your environment. And really just roaches, mice, mold, horrible, horrible Dickensian conditions in a shelter system that was run by a city agency that had a nearly $1 billion yearly budget. This was an intentionally punitive place. As horrible as it sounds, it provided Dasani what up until the time she moved in, she lacked, which was shelter. She'd been serially displaced. She'd had up to 9 addresses by the time she arrived at Auburn when she was 10 years old. And that is, the impact of serial displacement is something I saw again and again. It's what the social psychiatrist Mindy Thompson describes as root shock, which is how horticulturalists describe plants that have been transplanted to new soil, that it shocks the system and it can even cause them to die. Her definition of the impact of root shock is that it is a traumatic stress reaction to the destruction of one's emotional system. So what was emotional ecosystem? What was Dasani's ecosystem? Well, to her, what kept her, so as horrible as this all sounds, what I come back to is the point I made about innovation. Kids are naturally creative, right? They see the horror, but they also see the beauty. And they make do with what they have. And so she found all these sort of moments of quiet, moments of beauty, moments of anchoring in her room, beginning with her window. Every morning she'd go to her window and look at the Empire State Building. Then she'd get to work helping her siblings out the door, walking them to school. She considered herself a third parent, something that she was proud of, but also frustrated by. Her own parents, Chanel and Supreme, struggled with the same opioid addiction that has taken much of America and has led to more than 1 million overdose deaths since the 1990s, as chronicled by Beth Macy and many others. They got hooked the same way a lot of white Americans did. Chanel was prescribed OxyContin during a long hospital stay. And by the time I met them, they were in and out of drug treatment programs. And they were very open and brave and forthright with me about this struggle of theirs. I'm going to show you just a very quick video of my early interaction with Dasani because I really it's important to me and I really like to bring her into the room and have her voice be a part of this. You can get a sense of both her, it's hard to watch at times, I will tell you, it's short, but I'm asking her about how she defines the perfect childhood. And you'll see that she makes reference to her parents' struggles with addiction. And this is a child who is very, very afraid of her family being broken up. And so this is dangerous territory. And so she wavers a bit in talking about it, describing it in different ways. And then you'll also see the way in which she pushes back at me.
In your imagination, what does the perfect childhood look like?
Quiet, flowers everywhere, sparkles on the ground. Mom and Dad always drunk though. A perfect childhood. Yeah, Mom and Dad can be drunk at a perfect childhood. Or they be nice. They give you whatever you want. They give you money, everything you ask for. Your room is always decorated nice. You always have good blingage. Your clothes will be nice. That's a perfect childhood.
Did you say drugged up?
Jumped.
Junked?
Drunk.
Drunk.
Some parents, they have perfect childhoods, but sometimes they get carried away. Like they be frustrated sometimes, and then they get drunk.
So you think that being drunk is a part of the perfect childhood? The parents are drunk?
Yes, because when they're drunk, you ask for anything, they tell you can get it. That's a perfect child.
Really, Dasani, you really think a perfect childhood is your
You
parents?
said use my imagination.
Okay.
I used it.
That's Dasani. I'm just keeping an eye on time here. There's so much to say. I spent years, journalists tend to use this word understand to describe what it is that our quest is. Usually when we're trying to gain access, I just want to understand. And it's actually a really good pitch if you think about it, even if you're talking to a very press savvy person or you're trying to get access to a very vulnerable set of people who have no experience with journalists or anything in between. Who doesn't want to be understood, right? And I mean, of course, that was my purpose, was to understand a lot of things, the systems in her life, but also what it was like to be growing up deeply poor in the richest city, one of the richest cities in the world, the city with the highest concentration of richest billionaires in the world, including the mayor, who's a billionaire. What was that like? And I kept saying that word, and then I finally looked up the etymology. Because I'm a word nerd, as is Chanel, by the way, they had an exercise every night where she and Supreme forced the kids to pick a word out of the dictionary. So they loved language, and we would always talk about the meaning of words. Understand comes from Old English, from the word understandin', and it literally means to stand in the midst of. And I think that's, if I had to summarize what I did in all those years with Dasani, it was to stand in the midst of her life. It was to ride the train. It was to stand in the welfare line. It was to see all kinds of moments, big and small, that I would never be able to unsee, as I said earlier. And one of her greatest role models was Faith Hester, this teacher who grew up in Bed-Stuy, and she was electrifying and amazing, and she's an incredibly important character in this book. She stands as a kind of contrast to Chanel. She kept saying to Dasani, if I could make it out of the projects, you can make it out too. She came from the same place that Jay-Z came from, and where he wrote the song Where I'm From, and these are the words where we call the cops the A-team because they hop out of vans and spray things in life expectancy so low we're making out wills at 18. That's Bed-Stuy, where Chanel saw the Dasani bottle in the 90s. Now, 2001, she sees the bottle. Now we're in 2012, and Bed-Stuy has become an emblem of gentrification. And that teacher, Faith Hester, a year after I met her and began following all of these lives, was, as she puts it, gentrified out of her neighborhood. Her landlord flipped her building, and she landed in the shelter system. 1/3 of parents in the shelter system, right now we have nearly 70,000 in the New York City shelter system, are working. She's one of the first people who called my attention to the child protection system, and I mentioned the systems that sound like they're providing help. I'm going to speed forward in the interest of time and just say a couple quick things. If you ever doubt that there's a geography to poverty, I'd urge you to look at the map at the beginning of this book, where I had Dasani chart for me these systems. Each of them have acronyms, by the way. Homeless Services is DHS, Criminal Justice is DOJ, Public Assistance HRA, Child Protection's ACS. None of these acronyms had the power of ACS. It's like saying ICE to a migrant kid, because ACS is the agency that could break up your family. And so there they are. And so she saw each borough in terms of those acronyms. They were mapped in her mind. She had a sort of map that other people just don't see because she grew up going to these places. In 2015, ACS did in fact remove the children. We can talk about that case later. Of all the kids, I never thought that anything could come between Dasani and her sister Aviana. And I'm going to close by reading this passage. Aviana was named after a pricier bottled water. 11 months later, they were Irish twins, Evian. They shared the same pillow, the same mattress, the same dresser drawer. They had secret handshakes. To this day, I was with them last week. If a joke, sometimes nothing will be said and they'll just start laughing, and it's like they've shared a joke through telepathy. And I'm like, what just happened? Like, they're so united. I really believe that they didn't see each other as individuals for the first 6 years of their lives. They were so close. And when they were taken away and put in different foster homes, something happened that I could never have predicted. which is that they became estranged. Forever Family writes Dasani on December 3rd, 2017, above a photograph on Facebook showing 3 new friends. They are throwing gang signs. Dasani, now 16, knows that her estranged sister Aviana will be rankled by this. To write Forever Family is Dasani's way of saying the opposite, that nothing is forever, not even family, that one's sister can be replaced as easily as one's own blood, which is not thicker than water, as their mother used to say. In the photograph, Dasani wears a red bandana in allegiance to the Bloods. One family is poised to take the place of another. Dasani has not seen Aviana in over a year. They last exchanged texts 5 months ago, but Dasani knows how to break her sister's silence. Precisely 2 hours and 35 minutes after Dasani posts the Forever Family photo, Aviana appears on Facebook clicking a digital hand. The hand waves at her sister. Dasani waves back. "Hey sis," writes 15-year-old Aviana. A feverish correspondence follows. They agree to meet the following weekend at a subway station in Queens. They are both nervous, so Aviana sends detailed instructions. Dasani must take the A train to Broadway Junction, then the J train to Queens. To the last stop, get off, go upstairs, and then meet me at the turnstile. Queens is not Dasani's turf. She asks for the name of the station, which worries Aviana. Nothing can be left to chance. Instead, they settle on Broadway Junction, which is impossible to miss. "Got you, sis," Aviana writes. On the afternoon of December 10, Aviana leaves her foster home in Queens, and Dasani leaves her foster home in Staten Island. They check their phones. "I'm on the train," writes Aviana. "Me too," writes Dasani. By 1:28 p.m., they are minutes apart. Both trains arrive, and the sisters dismount. They cannot find each other. Aviana writes that she is here. Dasani writes that she's coming upstairs. Aviana writes that she's coming down. "No," Dasani writes, "she's coming up." "Where are you at?" Dasani asks. Aviana's at the turnstile. "Come to the escalators," writes Dasani. The thread stops. The station stops. 2 sisters are crashing into each other. They have no words. They hold each other like refugees who have crossed an unseen border. Everyone is watching. "Mind your own damn business," Dasani manages to shout from her sister's impossible clutch. She cannot breathe like this. "No one hugs like this. You're holding me too tight. Let me go, let me go." No one lets go. They stand like this for minutes. They already know their next move. The A train will come, taking them to downtown Brooklyn, where their mother is waiting. The train is coming, the very train that their grandmother used to clean. It pulls into the station. The doors open. Okay, I just want to say, when I wrote that, I thought that was the end of the book. That was one of 3 endings I wrote, because things kept happening. The final ending stuck, but speaking of endings, good moment to transition. Yeah, okay.
That was terrific.
Thank you. Oh, I can show you guys a photograph of Dasani today, in case anyone wants. That's Dasani. They've been reunited. We can talk about them. Dasani, Chanel, and Aviana. They're together again. Okay.
Thanks.
Sure.
Okay, that was great. Thank you.
Is it over here?
Yes. All right, so we're going to talk for a little bit, kind of toggle back and forth between the two of us, and then we'll open it up for questions from all of you, and my staff will manage that. But I want this to be as engaging as possible, because this is an incredibly powerful story. It's a real privilege to sit here with you and have this conversation about Dasani. It also, rereading the book, called to mind several comparisons to another author we had here recently, Barbara Kingsolver, who wrote Demon Copperhead, based on David Copperfield, OxyContin, missing parents, death from drug overdoses, and both stories, this is Dasani's story, that story is Damon's. So aside from the obvious parallels, I was curious about special ethical challenges maybe that you may have had with becoming close to the family to begin with, earning their trust or having them feel comfortable, and secondly, focusing on the child who at the time was a minor, and her parents certainly had to be supportive. So how did you navigate some of those early challenges in getting the level of authenticity and bravery and courage that you've managed to do with the book?
Well, this is a great way into a conversation. It's way to start with the most complicated thing, though. we could spend the whole night talking about this. Let me say a few quick things. I'm forever wrestling with the ethical questions that this work raises. I think it's important to face them, to think about them, to never feel too comfortable about the notion that we've arrived at an answer, because this work is important. So it's not that we should be afraid, but we should never feel too comfortable. I didn't have a lot of guidelines from the newsroom, to be honest, because we just don't do a lot of immersion. It's a real niche. There's a handful of us that do this kind of work, and we tend to get on the phone with each other and say, like, what do I do about this? What do I do about that? The rule book on relations with sources at the New York Times, at the point at which I began this project, literally read like something out of Mad Men. There was a section on relations with sources, and it was like, you may enjoy a round of golf with your sources, but you have to pay for your martini, or it's almost like that. I mean, it was just, because these rules were baked at a time, in the 1950s for the most part, when the paper was very focused on protecting itself from the perception of corruption, right? That gifts cannot exchange hands, that we are independent, that we're not going to be influenced by the powers that be. But what about the powerless? So we're allowed to take our sources to lunch, we pay. Mm-hmm. What if the people you're taking out to lunch, for them, food is the transaction? Right, so there was just a lot of new terrain. And where I found greater clarity was with academics, and especially with ethnographers, most memorably the great and late Liane Fluji, who worked with Rwandan genocide victims, and she and I talked a lot about this. And her view was that wrestling with the ethics is the price we pay for the privilege of this work, and that you can't ever stop. And part of the wrestling is to, for example, in getting close, and let's talk about that, because that's really important, one has a tendency sometimes to obscure the built-in asymmetry of power that your relationship represents. Oh, because we're hanging out, it's all okay. No, I hold the keys to the story. I have all kinds of power and she did as an academic in doing the research, that the subject will never have. And there's all kinds of other power that imbalances that exist when reporting on vulnerable communities. And so what about getting close? I think at the beginning of my career, I was, very much shaped by the old kind of newsroom that is almost a memory now. In 1999, I began covering cops in courts at the Miami Herald. And, it was entirely about, I ask the questions, you answer them, distance, be afraid of emotions, don't allow your feelings to cloud your judgment, accuracy and balance and objectivity, which are all good things to reach for. But what I came to see, both in reading things and like work that just really excited me, Kate Boo's work, Beyond the Beautiful Forevers, Alex Kotlowitz, There Are No Children Here, just works of immersion, is that I felt myself transported the more intimate the writing was. And I don't think you can access that kind of intimacy without allowing your emotions to also serve as a guide. And why can't both things be true? Why can't I be fully available to all the range of emotions that I as a human am bound to have, and also see things with clear distance? And so I've learned that kind of thing can actually elevate the work. But trust is not a destination. I think it's a work in progress. I never took the family's trust for granted, ever. And we talked about it when things got weird. Like, my job is really weird. I remember Dasani, like 3 years in, she's like, this is just weird. I mean, you're always around. Like, how is it your job to follow my life? I was like, I know, I'm way past my latest deadline. It's just, there was so much to learn and follow. Her tiny baby sister put it best at the age of 3. And I mean, I really immersed. I remember spending the night in my sleeping bag just to know what it was like to wake up in their home in Staten Island, where they struggled with heat issues and the cold and sometimes not enough in the fridge, and just really trying to observe as much as I could. And Lily looked at me at the age of 3, as children are apt to do because they say the truth. She said, every time I see you, you're in my house.
That's great.
And I was like, I should put that on my business card. Like, that is a perfect, I will be in your house. Like, that's such a strange job. And so let's talk about how odd it is or weird or strange that, like, my job is to observe you. There's a lot more to say. I'll stop there because we want to hear from Anita too, I'm sure.
We do. I want to just follow up one brief comment, though, because a lot of what you describe, some of this stuff is really tough. I mean, yes, there's the decapitation of the mice and all of that, but there's just revelations about the parents and their backgrounds, et cetera, that's very difficult. And I think it was maybe you were talking to Chanel, and she said, well, you know, it's all okay with me because the truth hurts. And they were...
at times, and then at times at one point, I remember she compared being investigated by me was, to her mind, she said it was like having an autopsy performed on you and you're still alive.
That's great.
Like, there's no part of me that you haven't looked at.
Right.
But
they were okay with this level of intimacy. Well, okay. I mean, the book is published.
Yes.
And they presumably signed off on it. And I remember you talked about reading the entire thing to the 2 girls, Aviana and Dasani.
Yes.
So I'm not saying it wasn't without challenges, but it just, you were able to reveal a world to the rest of us that I just can't imagine being immersed in to the degree you were, and then writing this incredibly humane, balanced story that all of us should be paying way more attention to than we are currently.
You know, thank you. I think it got to the point where I was so deep in, and Chanel understood the stakes, that I had to make it clear, I need to know, there can't be any secrets.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we can discuss if things need to be off the record or not, but there's nothing I can't know.
Right.
And what I found was remarkable about the family, the things that were really hard for her to share were things like her drug history, which I had all the records, right? I knew when, I could see through time and history when she was testing positive or negative, you know, her periods of sobriety. This is an extraordinary amount of transparency. That act of vulnerability in a world where to be vulnerable is not just like not normal, it's actually can be dangerous, was extraordinary. It was extraordinary, the trust.
So I want to talk a little bit now about the systems. Anita and I both work for county government, so we are the system. We are the man. And I know Anita in her job has to think a lot about the balance between what's best for the individual and keeping within policy, so.
Well, I was going to follow up on the last comment where, you know, I think your ability to show what was going on with the family, but with such respect and dignity, is really what, you know, allows the story to be told and to be felt by everyone without seeming like you're a voyeur of poverty or racism or something. And I think the same things that you're talking about, these principles of understanding and standing with people who are living these experiences, is precisely what's wrong with our system. Even in Arlington, where we have co-located services. I mean, it's nothing like, you know, we're 25 square miles. I grew up in New York City, you know, to get from Brooklyn to Staten Island is like practically a day's trip, you know.
Yeah.
So we co-located in the early 60s, where we have the housing and the child welfare and the homeless services and everything in one place. But just because you're co-located doesn't mean the people who are working with those who really need the support have the respect and the you know, sense of, I value you and your experience and I can help you. There's always this power differential, you know. I've got what you need. Prove to me that you're worthy of it. And that's, you know, how do you think local government can make a difference, you know, even, you know, in terms of transforming the way we work with people?
You guys,
That's a big question.
There are no softball questions, which I didn't expect, but these are like the biggest questions of our day. I mean, truly, as an observer of policy, not a policymaker, you know, I have some observations to share. And it took me a while to even put words to this. But what I kept observing was, first of all, these systems are human-made. And so there's a variety of things that can happen, but it's really random and it's really luck when you find the caseworker who's like, you know what, this isn't okay, I'm gonna fix this for you, versus I'm gonna make one call that ends your family. I mean, it can be so precarious.
Right.
And what I kept seeing was that these systems that are external, that Dasani learned to survive but also be afraid of, existed as a kind of constellation around this other system of her own family's creation, which was them, that no one seemed to notice. And that if I were like dropped on planet Earth from some other planet and was just observing this, I'd be like, what about the house, right? You got HRA and all these other, what about investing in that one? Because that's also a system. It's like families are not treated like an asset
Right.
to invest in. And the best example I have of this is what happened when the family was broken up. Broken up on accusations of neglect because of a bunch of bureaucratic lapses that were in part also the parents were not doing well. Chanel had been removed from the home. Supreme was overwhelmed. Food stamps got cut off. They were without food. He was overwhelmed. He didn't need ACS to come in and give him parenting classes. He needed someone to work phones for him. He was overwhelmed. And rather than do that, rather than bolster him up, when families of means are in crisis,
Right.
your neighbor's kid gets really sick. What do we all do? We show up with casseroles, right? We work the phones, we offer. We don't say, okay, wait, first you need to get into therapy, and then we'll fix the practical problems. But when families that are poor end up in crisis and are monitored, the stress is off the charts because it's just added to. It's like, now you need to do this and do this and do this and do this, or it's all gonna end. And so he couldn't handle it, the wheels came off, and what did they do? They took 8 kids out of this home that was food insecure, struggling in all kinds of ways, no electricity, and put them in a system that wound up spending $33,000 a month on those 8 kids.
Right.
Right.
Like, how is that okay? So I just think there's so many ways to look at this, but just in the silo of child protection, why is it that our federal government invests 10 times the funds in programs that separate children from their families rather than in programs that keep them together, which is prevention? Instead, it's adoption or it's
Foster care.
foster care.
Right.
So
Right.
that's my answer.
Well, I always say the cost of doing nothing is not nothing, you know? I mean,
We need a whole family approach.
a whole family approach, right? And so much more, I mean, I think a lot of our government systems were gutted, you know, well, I won't talk politics, but we know which president. You know, so that we were now only responding to when things got bad and crisis and not investing
Exactly.
in
So
the
you
prevention and the preservation.
You talked about co-location. So, okay, supportive housing, that's a co-location
Right.
approach. You put a family like this in a place that also, it's a little bit like the shelter, but better. They have a roof over their heads, they have a social worker on the premises, they have other supports, maybe help with job training, everything is there. Supportive housing is expensive. Like last I checked, it was like $80,000 per person per year. People balk at that. It's very hard to to get people behind that politically. Like, that's really expensive. But we never talk about how expensive poverty is. Like,
Right.
we pay for poverty. We pay for it on the back end. We pay for it. Poor kids who are raised poor are twice as likely to be incarcerated, are twice as likely to have health ailments like asthma and diabetes, or to have a child out of wedlock, or to not be able to participate in the labor market. I mean, we're paying for this very expensive problem in all the wrong ways, and we're not investing to prevent it. There's just like this, it's a very strange system.
Well, the other point that you make really well is success for a child like Dasani means leaving the family, leaving what's familiar, leaving her neighborhood, leaving everything that she holds dear, sending her to boarding school.
The kid who got out. It's
Right,
always
the kid
that
who
narrative.
got out, and it was, well, it was devastating to the family, as you pointed out, because she was such an integral part of the management of their system. So can you talk a little bit about, for those who maybe haven't read the book yet, the boarding school experience and what happened to the family?
Sure. So we were sitting in Dasani's beleaguered public school in Brooklyn. I'd gotten to know her principal really well, this extraordinary matriarch of education who has since passed away, Paula Holmes. Paula had seen everything, and she loved Dasani, and she, you know, at a certain point she saw what was happening, that Dasani had too much on her plate, and that despite all her talents, there was no way to compete with the burdens she faced at home, and that she was going down the wrong path. Not even of her own volition, just stuck at home taking care, helping be a parent. And she said to me, you know, there's only so much a public school can do. And I said, well, what's the alternative? And she said, foster care, or, well, there's this third thing, which is Hershey. And I was like the candy bar? I'd never heard of, I'd heard of Hershey candy. Well, the chocolate magnate, Milton Hershey, didn't have kids, left his entire fortune behind to create this school that rescues children from poverty. It's the most fascinating little-known story. I mean, most people, a lot of people, now they know about it because of the book. Anyway, Hershey, Pennsylvania is named after him, the town, there's, you know, the theme park, and then there's the school. About 2,000 kids go to this school. They live in, they're removed from their families of origins and put in homes with real married couples called house parents, 12 kids per couple. And they are given this parallel childhood. Every need is taken care of, braces, full wardrobe, ballet classes, tutoring, and they can live there year round. And she got in. Her sister didn't get in, she got in. And she leapt at the chance, and she got there and she took off. She leapt ahead 2 math levels. She joined the track team. She became a cheerleader. She was thriving. And you know, you notice in the video when I said describe the perfect childhood, she said quiet. That was the first word that came out of her mouth, which is striking because I know if I asked my kids to describe the perfect childhood, the first word would not be quiet. It would be like, you know, endless amounts of candy or whatever. It really was a luxury, and just to see her settle into the quiet and not have to wake up in the morning worrying about filling the bottle for the baby or the food stamps or all these other things, and to have good meals and to have the stability. In her absence, though, and she does believe it's because she was gone, things disintegrated. And then while she was at Hershey, this tragic thing happened, and her family broke. And caseworkers came to the school and told her, and it was the greatest crisis of her life. Mm-hmm. She couldn't reconcile the suffering of her siblings with her own privilege. She felt, you know, her entire life she'd been wired to, whatever happens, stay together, stay together, stay together. And suddenly, by staying in this other place, she was abandoning them. And so she got kicked out and repatriated herself. And I don't think there's a way to give away what happens in the book, because it's about how it happens, not what happens. Yeah. But she came back and entered the foster care system, and then when all things were equal again, I think she found really what feels like her authentic place in the world, which is to live with her mom, live with her sister, and live with her little brother, Papa, stable housing. She became the first in her family to graduate from high school. It's not fancy Hershey, but she graduated. She enrolled in community college. She now is working a steady job. Mm-hmm. She's by her own measure, actually happy. And so that's another thing that following her life has gotten me to reconsider, is how we define success. What is our measure of happiness? And also like this narrative that you have to leave, that you must depart in order to succeed means you're leaving behind this whole other community. Are we saying that that's the answer, that we give up on the whole community?
And it was so reminiscent of the way you started when you were describing the way the child welfare system came into being, of these, society, of benefactors who said, oh, all these kids need is a nice place to go into the countryside where they can be, breathe fresh air. And here we are, 100 years later, and it's just a repetition of the same.
From the very beginnings of our child welfare system, this has been a country that has offered, as a policy response to poverty, family separation is the answer.
Yeah.
From the orphan trains to the present day.
Yeah.
And it is especially brutal and offensive and deeply emotionally violent is how I would describe it.
Yeah.
The experience of a black family seeing their children get separated in this way in a system that involves tremendous profits. The agency overseeing their separation, the CEO, was made $500,000 that year. When, if you go back, and this book is also a look at history, I went back more than 2 centuries to find the original white enslaver of her family and saw that her great-great-great-great-grandfather, David, was listed because back then black people were treated as property, and records is the only way to see that they existed. They were not treated as humans. So they're in deeds of gift, they're in estate records and wills. And David was listed as worth $100 at the age of 5. And a few years later, we see that his sister Chastity, 11-year-old Chastity, it's just noted that she was sold off to another plantation, separated.
Wow.
And this is, our history writ large, right? We know this, but to know that this is her grandfather, because her parents were saying to me all along, this is a modern version of slavery. And in the beginning, I was like, okay, maybe that's a little extreme. And now I say, who am I to say that? I was so blind to this other city that existed in my own midst.
Yeah.
Well, then you also have her grandfather served in World War II,
Yes.
came back, couldn't find a job. The unions
Yes.
froze him out. Redlining prevented him from, he didn't have enough income, and then he couldn't buy a house, so he was relegated to being a janitor.
Okay, this is the most extraordinary discovery of the book because nobody knew this. They all said, okay, he drank a lot and he was mopping floors and he'd tell these crazy stories about some distant war and none of us believed him and we didn't want to believe. And on a lark, I filed a Freedom of Information request to the National Archives, and 8 months later, boom, this massive file comes in.
Right.
He joined the Buffalo Soldiers. He had served in the 92nd Infantry, the only all-black infantry to fight in Europe during World War II. He'd survived 3 major battles in Italy. He'd returned with 3 Bronze Service Stars to the Jim Crow South after fighting Nazis and fascists abroad, comes home to this division, gets denied all the benefits that his white fellow veterans got, didn't get to be a homeowner. That's why I said, I began with this is a story about a homeless kid. What is homelessness? Well, there's roots to homelessness. There's roots to poverty. There's dots that you have to connect back in history. When you see what happened to him, we always talk about the public safety net, that it's, either frayed, people criticize it, or people criticize the poor for depending on it. We rarely talk about the private safety net that shores up white families, where white families have been able to amass 10 times the net worth of black families. That story begins in the 50s when the middle class was created, in large part fueled by the GI Bill, where people, except for people like him, got to buy homes and wealth carried over through generations. Instead, he was relegated as a renter and stuck what he made, and I got his wage records, compared to what he could have earned. That gap, I can give you a number, is $190,000.
Incredible.
Which is huge.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, it's not an abstract thing that she inherited a poverty that had been, the foundations of which began long before her. And it's really important to know that. I think that was, for me, the greatest discovery, and for Dasani as well. She's very proud of the story of her great-grandfather having been this decorated veteran, and no one even listened to him.
Right.
They didn't believe him.
Yeah. You said earlier about being a word nerd. even the words that we use to describe the situation, they all seem automatically pejorative. You know, homeless, welfare mothers.
That's right.
Poor children.
The cycle of poverty.
The cycle of poverty.
We never talk about the cycle of power or the cycle of resilience.
No, we don't. And
it represents.
Your book will absolutely, for those who choose to pay attention and listen, opportunities to see it from the other side. But I kept thinking as I was reading about Bill Clinton and, you know, the 3 strikes and the welfare mothers and the implication that, well, if you don't have a job, it's because you don't want to work. You want to be on the dole, you want to be on the public nickel, not recognizing that some people can't get a job because they're former felons or
Right.
they had other kinds of difficulties. A lot of felons who are no longer felons paid their debt to society and can't vote, so they can't even
Right.
participate in local government, policy making, et cetera.
That is what Chanel would say is the system working exactly as it's designed, by the way.
Right.
And we were with these wonderful women today who are inmates, and some of them you can imagine coming out into the world again, having so much to offer, and then coming up against this wall. They know the wall is waiting for them.
Right. But it's like what you were saying earlier, too. They have skills.
Yes.
It's just not the kind of skills that people typically put on a resume.
Right.
You worked for a long time in what, economic independence?
Right. Well, and you know, even with the possibility of having employment, you know, and there are programs that we have to help reemploy people who were previously jailed. But you need 3 jobs, 3 minimum wage jobs just to pay like the rent. You know, the gap between what a person who has less education and has these barriers on their resume can obtain in terms of their wage versus what it costs just to live, especially in a place like this or in New York, it's untenable.
So people often talk about poverty as the result of poor choices, adults making poor choices. I've come to see it very differently. I think, especially in this family, I think as this book shows, it is so often about the absence of any choice at all. It's you're so busy surviving. Think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which really, really played out in fully in front of me with respect to watching them survive things. I mean, at the base of this pyramid are the physiological needs: food, water, shelter. You have to have those in place to reach the next level and the next level. And only at the top do you have things like self-esteem, belonging, love. If you're so consumed, and this is where they always were, was at the bottom, how are they expected to thrive if they're always surviving? But you'd have to spend time walking with them to see it. I remember, Faith Hester, the teacher, she had 2 master's degrees, and we were standing in welfare because she was forced to go there as part of the requirement for staying in the shelter system. And she leaned in and she's like, "The grammar on the signs is incorrect. Do you think I should say something? Or will I get penalized?" And then we get up to the front, and something happened that day, procedural, that I definitely didn't understand, and she definitely didn't understand. And she's like, "I have 2 master's degrees. If I can't figure this system out, how is anyone else supposed to? It's just impossible." It is like it's a real job to be poor. This idea that they don't work, it just drove me crazy. They're always working in some way. The wheels are always turning. How am I going to put food on the table? How am I going to get to the next paycheck or food stamps allotment?
You mentioned the public schools and these 2 very important women, the principal and the teacher you just named. And I hadn't thought previously much about how important the public school is to children like Dasani and her siblings. It's shelter, it's warm in the winter, it's often food, it's occasionally clothing, it's stability, it's somebody taking an interest and saying, "I believe in you." And all I could think of was what we experienced over the last couple of years with the closed schools and the pandemic. And the test scores are out, and guess what? 49 out of 50 states, they're low. Wow, who knew? And what do we do with that? And that's among everyone. What does it say about families, children like Dasani and her siblings? Do they ever catch up? And what happens to them? And where is the emphasis on making sure the the public schools are the best they can be, as opposed to, oh, well, charter school, or there's a private school, et cetera. Not everybody chooses.
It's funny, as you're saying this, I'm thinking, I almost would liken the public school system to, there's an analogy to be drawn with respect to the family. Like, the school system is so busy doing all the anti-poverty work that other programs can no longer do or aren't funded.
Right.
This is our biggest anti-poverty program, right? Is the school system. It is meals throughout the year, provided in most places you can access them. It's surrogate parenting. It's a second home. Libraries are another second home. Right. Big for Dasani. But they're freighted with so many things that have to be tended to, medical care included, before they can even begin the job of educating. Faith Hester had to do so many things before she could even have her students ready enough to learn so she could teach. She would bring in snacks. It was just, it's astounding to me the degree to which schools are expected to pick up the slack of a otherwise very, very limited safety net.
And it's one of the few places where I think vulnerable families really feel trust and support. Like, we have a very high number of undocumented households in Arlington. They won't come to our Department of Human Services necessarily. They'll go to the teacher, the social worker, and the school, and there, because school is basically unconditional in terms of being accessible to those families, that's where they're going to go for their support. So we have to really try and work much closer with the schools to support them in having that kind of system of support for the families. But and I really think that it's also, the teachers are so important in terms of a trusting adult.
They're a lifeline.
They are the lifeline.
Faith Hester, I'll never forget, I quoted Jay-Z earlier and about making wills at the age of 18. She took such risks as a teacher. One day she came into class with the idea that she would assign her kids. Most of them did not expect to live past 21. She'd lost a number to gun violence. Violent crime is up 30% in the last year in New York City.
Yeah.
We've lost over 111 kids this year alone to gun violence in New York City. She said, the assignment is you're going to write your own obituary. One condition, you can't die before you're 70.
Oh.
What did you do with your life? And, it was extraordinary. And parents flipped out. They were like, what kind of crazy assignment is this? But it really got them thinking past that, I'm going to die at 21, I'm just living in the moment because it's all over. And like, what did I do? Or as she put it in her own words, I wanted them to see that they are the authors of their lives.
Right. Reminds me of, there's an anecdote in There Are No Children Here, where Lafayette, he's asked about aspirations for growing up, and he says, well, if I grow up, I want to be a firefighter. And I was just so strong. Wow. That's something that most of the rest of us take for granted. We mentioned public libraries a second ago. So I'm going to fly the flag for public libraries. Elizabeth Campbell, who was a local hero, established public television, and she once said, the three pillars, public television, public schools, public libraries, being so important to the vitality of a community. And when you talked about the word understand earlier, and being in the midst of, that's what we believe in the public library. We are in the midst of community. We help shape community. We provide welcome to newcomers. We provide resources. When they're not going to their teachers, they're probably coming here to use the computers and to get help on filling out a form. I remember during the pandemic, just filling out the vaccination form to get an appointment was a barrier to so many people. So can you talk a little bit then about the importance of the library and reading to Dasani and her family? I think you wrote that Chanel and Supreme both were real avid readers.
Yes, so they're very proudly self-taught. They both dropped out of high school. Supreme because he wound up in prison very early at the age of 16. And he got his GED and then was able to reform himself after leaving. Chanel just, yes, they have self-educated and they read all my work as part of the my way in was to give them all my work and to have real dialogues with them about the things I'd written. And they were just very attached to the meaning of words. And one of, the library was absolutely essential. Walt Whitman Library was this tiny little public library where Dasani's grandmother had gone as a kid for shelter, where everyone in the neighborhood went. And, you know, these places to outsiders just seem like, okay, this is just another library. They are such a lifeline. I mean, people asked me in Fort Greene after the original series ran in the New York Times of Dasani's life, you know, what can we do? What can we do? They were thinking big sweeping things like, I'm going to give money to this thing, or what, you know, asking me. And my response was, if you live in Fort Greene, just go by the library one afternoon a week and sit there and see whose homework you can help with. Because it's like a sea of needy kids, and these librarians talk, it's like another form of Faith Hester. They're doing all this other work in addition to being librarians. I mean, it was extraordinary. But the family's attachment to language is something that carries through the book, and is one word that I've been thinking about a lot lately, because I got so used to it, I stopped thinking about it, was the word they used by way of greeting and by way of saying goodbye, which is the word peace. Yeah. Because they didn't want to ever say goodbye. And peace, in the religious teachings they followed of the 5% nation, which is an offshoot of the Nation of Islam, stands for properly educating all children everywhere. And so they were always looking for the meaning of words. But it really moved me that, and saddened me that they never wanted to say goodbye, because, you know, Dasani in particular, her life had been marked by so much loss, so many departures, that goodbyes were really painful. And I've been thinking a lot about their use of the word peace in the presence or in the face of or against, you know, evidence all entirely to the contrary, right? That they would hang on that word, that they would stay rooted and anchored in that word. Chanel wrote the word peace at the end of a complaint she filed the night that her mother's urn containing her mother's ashes was tossed in the garbage, in the incinerator at Auburn. It's like, you lost my mother's ashes, and at the end, peace. Dasani's brother is now at Rikers facing a murder charge, and you know, Rikers and New York City jails have had more deaths this year than ever on record. We've lost 18 inmates. It's a humanitarian disaster. Khalik got beaten up really badly by corrections officers recently. He was in solitary confinement. I talk to him once a week, and he never says goodbye. He just, at the end, it's a very gentle peace. It's like, you know, this, if they can say that word in the midst of everything that they're experiencing, we have absolutely no right to believe in its possibility. That's what I would say.
So we're going to pause up here and turn it over to all of you for some questions or comments or, okay, yes, sir, right here in the front row, please.
Thank you for coming in. This is just a remarkable piece of journalism. You talked about getting into the family, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what it's been like getting out.
Yeah, I've never been
you have to move on to other things, and they stay in their world. And can you talk just a little bit about what it's like for you to have to step away, and what it's like for them to have their story be out there, and you know they're still in that world?
That's such a good question. You know, it's been a very hard transition, because I want to say, as upsetting as a lot of the material I witnessed, as a lot of the events of their lives were, as upsetting, I don't see this as a catalog of sorrows, or as a book that's defined by hardship, because I really see the through line as one of joy, because that's what I felt in their presence. I felt happy to be with them. I felt challenged by it in really interesting ways, and excited and fascinated. And so it was hard to let go. And I remember it hit me with the final scene I witnessed that I would never again witness a scene as a reporter in their lives, and that was a big transition. I've stayed close to them. I had a very careful fact check process with them. I wanted them to feel utterly prepared for what was coming. They were extremely brave and very generous in not asking for me to change things. They wanted their story out there. And yeah, it's a transition. It's a big transition.
How about for them?
I mean, they're in the Bronx. I mean, I see them regularly and we're in touch, but you know, I think they're relieved that they don't have a person observing them anymore. I mean, I can't imagine what it would be like to have me, or anyone for that matter, you know, in my life for almost a decade, just like there to observe.
I really appreciated the articles you wrote, and the sympathy it creates for trying to do something. I'm a policy person, and I struggled with, well, what do we do? And Hershey obviously is too expensive to do for everybody, but it doesn't even satisfy what you pointed out. It separates the family. So it's almost as bad as adoption by a rich family or something. So you were suggesting that you bring somebody in, that would be much cheaper than the $400,000 a year. But I'm wondering, playing that out, you bring somebody in, they're going to notice all those failures in the house, the sink that's broken, so you got to fix that, and then all the medical conditions and the psychological, you got to send them to these doctors, whatever, and the bill probably adds up to $400,000 or $500,000 for this one family. And also you mentioned the inequality from racism, so maybe you take $8 trillion in reparations, which is what one Duke scholar estimated, but that I don't think that's practical. We're not going to get a Congress that's going to vote $8 trillion. Do you have any thoughts of, I mean, you did say go into the library and help tutor, or you could volunteer with the school, but
That is incredibly hard to do. Volunteer with the school,
okay.
I will tell you about that.
All right, well, let's
But
finish here.
the question is, in terms of policy, and you've undoubtedly talked to a lot of people, they've read your work, they feel the sympathy, what do we do? I'm talking policymakers. Are there any specific suggestions that you think we could fix that are practical?
I mean, I go back to what was missing for this family. I think I'm a believer in a universal right to housing. My father, who passed away last year, was very instrumental in creating the Section 8 program. That program, which is federal subsidized housing program, is available to only 3% of Americans. It's been a lifesaver for this family. So Dasani's doing okay right now because of two variables: stable housing, family cohesion. Her family got back together, they're together, and they have a stable roof over their heads. So I just take a very practical approach. I could leave the sort of like social fixes or cultural whatever matters to other people, but I think that, you know, I was in the Netherlands recently, and I mean, they're fascinated by the book. They're appalled. They just can't believe how far we allow our children to fall in this country. So universal right to housing and basic income. We saw with the child tax credit, which evaporated, for that year that it was, you know, the pandemic relief program was there. 3.5 million children lifted out of poverty every month. And there's a lot of ongoing research looking at those households and how they spent their money. And lo and behold, people actually want to spend it on the right things. They do love their kids. There's such a paternalistic view of poor families that, you know, they don't know what they're doing. So there's some very basic things that we're not doing that I think need to be done before we can get really fancy about supportive housing, which you just described. I mean, I don't think it's $400,000. I still think that the city spent about $400,000 on this family. That's true. At one point, I did calculate that. There's no way that the money that was spent is more than the money that would be required to have done the right thing. And I know this one case very well. I think somebody could have come in and helped them in a way that would have avoided a lot of trauma that is now going to cost us.
Before we
Rikers,
go
it's
to your
costly.
question, I want to give Anita a chance to comment.
Well, I just want to tell you what's available in Arlington, because housing is the key.
Yes,
We're
first.
of course limited by HUD with how much we have for housing choice vouchers, Section 8. We have 1,500 households in basically a community where we have probably 9,000, 10,000 households living in poverty, right?
And a huge
25,000.
wait list, right?
Huge wait list. We don't even open the wait list, only every 10 years. But the local government, I do want to say this in favor of the county board, we have our own look-alike of housing choice voucher. We're the only place in Virginia you'll find this, called housing grants. And so we use similar thresholds of poverty. We focus on people who are disabled or working families or people with who are older, and we provide rental subsidy out of the local taxpayer dollars for another 1,500 households. Costs $15 million a year, but it's something that's really like, that is the anchor for people. They need a place to live where you can have a life and your family together, you know. So.
Please.
I really have a two-parter, and I don't want it all to dismiss the narrative that you've given us, where we're able to see and experience the lives. I mean, that's what books are all about. We are able to witness for ourselves what this family has gone through and what they're going through. But I do want to say a couple of things. First of all, about bureaucracy. I was so struck with the lack of respect these people were given. I mean, they could not have a microwave. They could not have an iron. If they didn't get back to their shelter by 10, they had to spend the whole of the next day with their children reapplying to go to the shelter.
It was your voice I heard as I was writing those passages. I was like, I'm going to get a reader who's going to feel that way.
Well, that's it. We were paying an enormous amount to certain people to oversee a bureaucracy which becomes an enforcer of rules.
Yeah.
No longer a compassionate helper.
Definitely.
Yes.
Yeah.
And however we support that, if that attitude is these people shouldn't be respected, is because that dignity is what every human being needs.
Great.
Absolutely.
Great.
I also want to say, as a retired person, and as someone whose son, like, I'm an upper middle class woman. I've lived in Arlington since 1980. My son, though, has spent time in the jail here, addiction, rehab, hospitalization. I have been to the mental health institute where I'm not a naive white lady. But I've tried to think, what can I do to help these people? And where could my strengths be helpful? And I have gone to the schools. I've been working on this for about 2.5 months, trying to help with the reading. When I first saw the scores drop, and the first report wasn't just 3 weeks ago, the first report came out nationally like 2 months ago, but even before then, I came to the library and I said, do you all have a program where you help children? I don't know if I walked up to a table with someone doing homework that they'd necessarily be receptive to me. So I want to say that the schools are so busy trying to get it done that they can't even accept help. I mean, I find that,
It sounds like you two should have a side
well, I've seen you because I've been an advocate for the mentally ill, and I've used your programs that are underneath your, you
Yes.
know, but
Well,
the irony is, and I am so much a person who loves books and has always had that upbringing, and it's wonderful that these people that didn't have an upbringing full of books, still, it's there. But I really do want to know from the school system, the public school system, what can I do?
and it isn't just the public school system. I mean, the public library system has a lot of volunteer opportunities. We have people on site all the time who do tutoring. So maybe,
Well, I did come to the juvenile desk here, and I
Okay.
said, I want to help with emerging readers.
all right, so let's connect after the program, and I can give you my contact information, and we can
Yeah.
continue the conversation.
Okay, and thank you. I mean, I know I deviated a bit, but
That's fine.
Thanks for sharing.
you listen, and then you want to know what
Of course.
I do.
Agreed.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I wasn't going to say this, but I work in housing, and there are groups in Arlington Housing Corporation, Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing, that provide housing, and they do after-school programs where they need volunteers to help with reading and help with homework. So
That's true.
there are some programs out there. I encourage you to look into those. And I appreciate your comments about housing because, you know, both Matthew, Desmond, and yourself did a sort of a similar in-depth look and came out with the same similar conclusions. So I'm actually going to ask you more very logistical things. You know, this was an 8-year journey. When you started, you know, you wrote the article and then you decided to do the book. Was this always going to be following Dasani through high school, or was it like, I'm going to do this for 4 years, but hey, there's still more to look at. There's still more to look at. And then related to that, also very interested in, you mentioned at the very beginning about the ending and how you had many different ones. I kind of read, one day I got to the second to last chapter where it was really depressing. She'd gotten out of high school, she was getting in all these fights, and and that was the end of that chapter. It was only a few pages left, and very detailed, which I loved throughout, and then it's like, oh, this is the end. This is really, you know. And then I read the last chapter, and it's like very quick summary of all these great things that happened since. So I was just curious on that, and just how you got to the ending and how it kind of came that way. Yep.
How the sausage was made.
Yeah.
It struck me recently that the end of a book is maybe one of the most vulnerable places for the author, because it's where you finally, you're letting the reader know that you've left, right? You have let go, and there's, and it's never an easy decision how to do that. No, I did not plan. My mom and my brother Pablo and my 2 nephews are here, and they can attest to this. I mean, there were years where my family's like, okay, this is never going to get done. Like, this book doesn't even exist. She just loves this family and hangs out with them. But I mean, it was like, what I could say is that I was constantly humbled by it. I felt that I owed it to Dasani and her family and to the subject to stay the path, even if it meant some really brutal passages of learning about welfare history, or, you know, it is a book about so many things, and I wanted to get them all right, and so it just required that time of me, and I'd like to think that if I were to do it again, I would. I'm sure that I would be terrified if I knew then what I know now, that it would take this long. I don't know if I answered.
So it was never your intention to go 8 years. You were.
No, it was my intention to go maybe 2.
Oh, okay.
Actually, I'll tell you, I was getting close to kind of like, okay, I'm done. I'm going to start writing this thing, and it's going to be done in maybe 3 years total. And that's when the family the kids were taken in front of me. And I remember calling Kate Medina, Kate the Great, that's what I call her, my editor at Random House. And I just said, this is now a different book. I mean, I had to suddenly, in real time, scramble to make sense of this whole other system. Well, I was very focused on housing up until that point.
Yeah.
And suddenly it was like, wait, what? What just happened? Because of their housing, the kids were taken away and put in foster care? It just was astonishing to me. So, yeah, I followed the story. I allowed the story to, a book reveals itself as it goes.
Right.
And you do this full-time, or?
I did, somehow I did, yes. Yeah, we could talk more. A portion of the proceeds, I can only pray that proceeds will come because the book has not generated proceeds yet, but the more talks I do, I'm sharing very generously with the family. I feel that it is their story and that they should benefit. And I will also I just want to share this because I think it's good for people to know. Like the Pulitzer didn't really mean much to Dasani. I remember she Googled Pulitzer. She was very excited about Barack. That was like her Pulitzer.
Oh, yeah.
That was amazing. But for me, it obviously added value to my life in ways I can't even predict. So I felt it was fair for me to accept the prize, but give her the money. So the prize money that the book, that has come from has gone to the family, things like that. I just want people to know that this is a book about racial inequity, and I feel that it's just the way that I feel about it.
The trust, right?
The trust, yes. And it's all on my website if you guys want to see. Yes.
So before we get to the next question, we've been doing our part. We've certainly promoted the book in the talk this evening, but I found out that the book has circulated a few hundred times and it's still on our holds list, which means that there are lots of people waiting to read it. So I'm hoping that that helps spread what you're trying to do with the message of the book and the call to action that we're hearing from a lot of people that have read the book and want to do something. So it's a beloved book in Arlington.
It's a beloved. It's definitely been a kind of a marathon, and it has spread. I've had several people now tell me that they read it on their honeymoon, which I was like, I take zero responsibility for how that marriage goes.
Wow.
It's sort of an odd choice, but people are passionate about the book.
Please.
So you've talked a little bit just in the last few minutes about how you've been able to share some with the family, some of the monetary reward that's come with what you've done. I was wondering, as long as you were with the family, how difficult was it for you to maintain your role as an observer and not jump in and try to help them with immediate problems? How did you separate yourself?
This is a very good question. I answer it in quite a bit of detail in the book itself, in the afterword as well. I'll just quickly say that I felt it was such a complicated, it was like a high wire act in a sense, this issue of proceeds, because they absolutely should benefit from their own story. And at the same time, while I was in the trenches writing this and reporting it, I needed them to feel, I felt that it would be unethical to even raise that issue, because they needed to be volunteering entirely. Their decision had to be a voluntary one, not one made out of financial necessity. Most books don't make money, by the way, but was it to potentially, or was something to come out of this that would benefit them, and then that was the thing that kept them involved, even if they were uncomfortable, would feel was wrong, felt wrong to me. So I suspended that conversation entirely, stuck by the rules that we always had, that these are the rules of my profession. You're here out of choice. You can leave if it's your choice. That never happened, thankfully. And then when it was entirely done and off to print, I sat down with them and explained what was always my plan, which was, should it generate proceeds, you will be benefiting from this. Yeah. Thank you. And very, yeah.
So any other questions? Okay.
I'm wondering what you left out and whether you gave them an option of things that might be embarrassing, because...
I have a funny story to tell you about that. So the things that people I have found as a journalist don't want in a story are very rarely the things that you would think even matter. And then the things that you think they would definitely not want in, they seem not to. The best example I have of this is a militant jihadist named Omar Hamami from Alabama who joined the Shabab in Somalia, who ultimately died. But I wrote about his life for a cover story of the New York Times Sunday magazine. And his mother is from Alabama, American, his father is Syrian, and I was interviewing the dad. And the dad, I think, was a little bit sympathetic in general to some of Omar's political views. Anyway, just listen to me quietly as I went through all the facts of the story. It's a fact check. You know, Omar was last reported to have beheaded someone in Somalia. Like, he did it himself, you know, listened, didn't say anything. He was involved in this attack. He was involved in that thing, on and on and on and on. Okay, Shafiq, now we're going to talk about high school. So apparently in the 9th grade, Omar smoked pot. He did what? I was like, you know, I mean, wow. So now, you know, I can think of a couple of things. I can think of a couple of things where she was like, I don't know if I want that in there. Absolutely not germane. You know, I mean, it's amazing what she allowed me to write. So, no, I don't think, I really feel that I was blessed with incredible amounts of trust, and I just tried to do right by it.
All right, so we have 2 more questions, maybe? Yes? Okay.
So related to the helping out, not so much the monetary incentive, but I'm one, like, I see this injustice, and
you want to do something.
I want to do something.
Yeah.
You know, you're well connected. I'm sure you could pick up the phone and plus you saw things that Supreme did and say, hey, that's not his fault. You know, I'm going to go tell the judge. You know, so were there any times when you like either did something like that or tried to, I know you talked in the book, I think you put him up in a hotel and brought some food, but were there things like with the system where you kind of said, hey, I could be helpful? Or did you say, no, I'm a journalist, this is my role, and I got to stay out of it? I'm just curious that.
I mostly tried to stay out of it. Like for me, the line was with the kids, right? I had a really hard time seeing them suffer. And Nana in particular, who's now fully blind, but she was going blind. She was without her glasses, she'd lost them. This was early on, the first year, and she'd gone a month without them, and it was like, horrible because her parents were overwhelmed. They weren't taking her to the eye doctor to get them replaced. She had a special ophthalmologist. And I was sort of like, what do I do? Because if I step in and buy her the glasses I'm supposed to be writing about the reality. And then I was like, well, but I could actually call her eye doctor up and interview them, right? Like the place that helps her. And so I called Lighthouse for the Blind. I was like, you know, they heard like New York Times, and within 24 hours she had glasses. They were like, oh my God, she doesn't have glasses. She hasn't been here in a year. We need to get her back in. And like, so there were things along the way. I tried to write about them. You know, that's what I think you need to do. You need to square with the reader when you step in. Yeah.
Too short for this. I'm a legal aid lawyer, and I work adjacent to poverty as well, and I think that...
A lawyer? Legal aid?
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
The oldest law firm for the poor in the country, nonprofit law firm.
Yes. I don't work at DC Legal Aid. I work at a similar legal aid organization. But I am curious about, you know, when I think about my work and the ways I can be sustainable as a poverty lawyer, and my sort of exposure to the trauma that poverty causes. And I think that that's something that when anyone is sort of exposed to these systems, exposed day to day to what poverty is like for people, it can be really traumatizing secondarily to the person who experiences it. And I'm wondering if that's something that you felt when you were immersed in this, and how you addressed that feeling and those sort of secondary traumas that you were experiencing.
That's a great question. I thought I could handle it until I saw the kids get taken, and I knew them really well. And you know, they were calling me during those evenings when they could have access to a phone, because they all knew my phone number. And I definitely felt something shift in that period. The way that my own children internalized it was, Mom is driving around. It was like for 3 weeks I did this with the song Purple Rain on repeat. Like that was my way of coping in front of them. I didn't get into it with them, but Prince is my guy. And my answer to how to cope when it's not even my life and I'm just witnessing it, and it's so much harder that it's actually imagine what it's like to be them, is not satisfying for the very reason you just said, because we still do go through stuff. And my answer is to put it on the page. Like that is how I cope. The other thing I want to mention is my mom is here with us. She was a therapist and a mental health director for a long time at Clínica del Pueblo, which was in Adams Morgan. And she, yeah. She was a real early role model for me. She is an expert in PTSD. She lost a lot of patients to AIDS. She went through a lot as a therapist of loss, dealing with people bringing the scars of trauma from Central America. And I just remember, and like in high school, just seeing her come home and with all of that on her face, and then kind of just shutting the door and leaving it outside and being able to shift and not really talking about it much. And that was an example early on for me of both service and also like, in order to serve, I need to also have boundaries because I want to be able to survive. And I hope you can also find a way to stay the path because burnout is real.
Yeah, absolutely.
Teachers burn out more than anyone else I've met.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to wind down. I want to thank everyone for being here this evening to hear this remarkable story, engaging conversation. I thank my dear friend and colleague, Anita Friedman, who works on behalf of poor people and impoverished people and homeless people every day. And you know, she wears her heart on her sleeve, and that's a really good thing to do. And thank you, Andrea. This has been a remarkable conversation. This book is going to stick with me for quite a while. To me, still, the best word in the title is hope.
Yeah.
That it isn't just devastation and being depressing and talking about stuff that we don't like to talk about. Not to mention the insurmountable seeming policy problems and debates and conversations that we can have. But with writers like you shining a light on formerly unseen people, I think if enough of us can pay attention, incremental change is still change. So thank you all for being here this evening. Andrea was at the National Book Awards last evening and I think announced Imani Perry's winning.
I didn't announce it, I observed it, but it was amazing.
Imani Perry won, and she will be here in Arlington next June.
Ooh.
And we had scheduled that some months ago, so we're on the leading edge. And Matt
roll.
Desmond's been here, Catherine Boo has been here, amazing, amazing people, and you're now among them. So thank you.
I mean, great company. Thank you.
So we're going to do a book signing. Take it away. One more page, books.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thanks so much.